I am going to try to lay out some hope. And yes, the Olympics are going to be a theme you're going to hear a lot about, because I just wrote a piece that's going to be released in the next 2 days based on the Summer Olympics as the perfect backdrop of what we're going through right now. The Federal Reserve is trying to hit its mark and hit a soft landing and achieve that mark. Of course, the path to a soft landing is not all that unlike the path to the gold medal. It is paved with tears, setbacks, and doubts. The chorus of criticism the Federal Reserve has seen in the last few days has gone to a crescendo. And I think they're feeling a little bit remorseful. They didn't actually cut rates in July at their meeting last week. I now feel like a political analyst. I'm not going to talk about politics, that's not my lane, but the world is changing in years, in the course of days. The Federal Reserve thought it had plenty of time to cut rates. And now they discussed a rate cut at that meeting in July, and they didn't do it. Much like Olympic victories, soft landings look better in the history pages than they do actually in reality. And they're much harder to achieve. I want to give that context of where we are in terms of a soft landing and what it's really about, because I think most people misunderstand it. And I also talk about the outlook by sector. I'll talk about inflation and what it means for the Federal Reserve's decision on rate cuts. Last Friday, as the employment report came out, just a few days after the Fed actually met and decided they didn't need to cut rates, the unemployment rate popped to 4.3%, still low historically, but it triggered something that's called the SOM rule. It's not a hardened rule, but it's predicted every recession since the 1950s, with one exception in 1976. Now, much about the post-pandemic world is not like it was in the past. That's important to remember, because rules were made to be broken, and many have been broken post-pandemic. And that's something the Fed is counting on. And there are a lot of special factors that went into the reason we saw an increase in the unemployment rate, not the least of which was Hurricane Beryl. 461,000 people could not make it to work during the week of the survey for the employment because of the loss in power in Houston. That's the most for any July on record. The average disruptions due to weather in the month of July, 37,000 historically. So that was a big thing. So we'll think we'll get a little bit better, but it also, the pace of hiring has slowed. And when the pace of hiring has slowed, you don't have a lot of room and a lot of leeway to have layoffs pick up at all without creating a more vicious cycle of rising unemployment and a slowdown or contraction in consumer spending. The Fed was pretty confident going into that meeting because they had just seen GDP growth double in the second quarter from the first quarter, from 1.4% to 2.8%. And the consumer drove those gains because they became more discerning, pushed back on price increases. We saw discounting pick up, and consumer spending also increased. Now, the economic aggregates look good, and they describe everyone all at once, and yet no one individual at any point in time. I'm going to get into that a little bit later, because I know this doesn't feel as good as it looks on paper, and that gets back to what I said at the beginning, that soft landings look better in the history books than they do on paper. And to remind you of that, the most touted soft landing on record is the 1994-96 rate cycle, which I'm old enough to remember. I remember it well. I remember it better than most people actually understood it, because we were actually very close to Chairman Alan Greenspan at the time, so I knew what was going on. My mentor was an advisor to him. In 1994 through 1996, we saw a rate hiking cycle where Chairman Greenspan had a list, and he thought he'd check it all off and he would preempt inflation before it actually got started. The problem was he was chasing a moving target. He increased rates from February 1994 to February 1996, doubled them from 3 to 6%. In response, in the first half of 1995, the US economy stalled to a crawl. Unemployment in 1 month in April of 1995 popped 0.4% in 1 month alone. And we had 2 months, April and May, of red ink in employment. As a result, the Fed flinched. In July, they cut 0.25%, but then that red ink was revised away, and the Fed held on to rates higher for longer. Sound familiar? Well into 1996. As they were doing that, criticism of the Fed started to mount. Chairman Greenspan thought he could eradicate the US economy of inflation entirely by driving inflation measures to zero. One problem in that theory was that the inflation measures themselves were biased upward. That meant that if you took inflation to zero, you were actually going to trigger a deflation cycle, which Japan had already proven harder to escape than a bout of inflation. And that's when he got convinced, not by the backlash. One of the New York Times headlines from June 6, 1996, heresy at the Fed. Screams of rate cuts had gone into a frenzy. Chairman Greenspan's third term, he was nominated in early 1996, also an election year. He was not cutting rates, and Congress held it up for 4 months, his confirmation. Wall Street was incensed. Kind of hard to remember that by the end of that year, we were talking about the 2 words he uttered, irrational exuberance, in December of 1996. Amazing how quickly things can change. His colleagues convinced him, most notably one person on the Federal Reserve Board who had just joined the Federal Reserve Board, who had been working for the Fed 20 years earlier, Governor Janet Yellen, convinced Chairman Greenspan that something was changing, that productivity growth had accelerated, and that foreign competition had intensified. That had moved the target and was doing the hefty lifting for the Federal Reserve so that it did not have to do rate hikes to control inflation. And in fact, the inflation measures were overstating inflation as well. And between those two things, Alan Greenspan went on to do what was called the growth experiment, where he allowed the unemployment rate to fall. We also had the dot-com bubble, lifting the economy. We had the investment and the leapfrog investments triggered by Y2K. Remember that? This room should know what that is. All of that delivered us the experimentation with growth, the strongest and longest expansion to date, and the only time in decades and since that we saw income inequalities in this country narrow. It's no coincidence that consumer confidence, the measures of consumer confidence, hit an all-time high in January of 2000 as we were coming off the existential threat of Y2K. We made it through January 1st, 2000 without the lights turning off. People had filled up their bathtubs. My dad was on the cutting edge of technology, and even I was, a little worried. Filled up my bathtub just in case. And then I watched the world ahead of us strike midnight and the lights stay on, and I knew my dad was right, that in fact the lights would stay on. But what was important was that was an extraordinary time. We have never gotten back to that level of consumer confidence. How does all that translate today? Let's look at the economic outlook. Consumer spending has picked up, as I said, and consumers continue to spend. Home equity lines of credit, we just got the data this morning, came out, and they've picked up. Remodeling has picked up because people are tapping into the equity in their homes. Not like they did during the subprime crisis, using their homes as an ATM, but they're actually remodeling again, and it's showing up in spending on big-ticket durable goods. That's good. The bottom 30%, though, of households have lost all the savings they amassed to the pandemic and then some. and they're feeling pain. These are the workers that were once considered invisible that became essential. They moved from the shadows of the economy into the sun, got their wages leveled up, only to be burned by inflation. Over 50% of US households still have 3 months of expenses saved. That is more than we had pre-pandemic. It's off the peak, but it's still more than we had pre-pandemic. So as long as we don't derail what's left of employment growth, the economy can continue to grow. And that is the Fed's challenge. Why doesn't it feel as good as one would think it should, as an economist looks at it on paper? Because in reality, inflation has moved up and price levels matter more than the marginal change in inflation. Even though wages are now outpacing inflation, since 2019 to 2023, home values 50% up in value. Stunning. Rents up 30%. The average price of a car, $38,000 to $50,000. Wages and compensation for that same period, it's stunning, 16.2%. Why do most Americans still feel like we're in a recession, even though the US economy has been expanding and outperformed all of its peers around the world? Because many feel like they're still trying to recoup what they lost to inflation, induced by the pandemic and the stimulus that came with it. And that's painful. And that's why the Fed's job on derailing inflation is so important. But to do so without increasing unemployment is also important. The other part of the situation in terms of people's perspectives on the economy is we all now view the economy through the lenses of our partisan affiliation. Who's ever in the White House, if it's your party, then you feel better about the economy. You can literally see confidence flip the minute whoever is in the White House changes. That's crazy. The world doesn't change overnight, yet we are now, it is reflective of our polarization. But there's something else that's real about that as well. The movement of wealthy newcomers from former Democratic strongholds to arbitrage more space and cheaper costs of living and lower taxes in former Republican strongholds, bid up the costs in those Republican strongholds, which meant that Republican strongholds experienced more inflation than Democratic strongholds. The existing residents of those areas, even though their wages went up and they saw a boomtown come out of the pandemic, they got burned by inflation and they're angry. And that's understandable. And I think that's important to take into account as well. And that's part of the dissonance we're seeing. There's also a difference, of course, on how you get your information and how you feel about the economy. If you get it word of mouth or social media, your perspective on the economy is much more negative than if you get it from mainstream media or the business news. That's important too, because social media plays a much larger role than it once did. So the US economy, even though we have this sort of underlying discomfort, the aggregate numbers continue to show the economy in expansion, not a recession. Not even close, and there's plenty of room and runway for the Fed to course correct right now, which they need to do. Consumer spending can stay afloat as long as we continue to generate new paychecks every month. And so far, that's what we're continuing to do. We need to continue to keep doing that consistently. And the fear that we even lose a couple months, that wouldn't mean a recession yet, but you don't want to get into that vicious cycle of a downward spiral. We have a lot more healing to go from the pandemic. Also, people look at wages as earned. Wages stagnated for over 2 decades. And all of a sudden, they finally got their wages leveled up. That's because of my skill. That's not because of a boomtown. That's not because the economy's strong. But inflation, that's not a reflection of the economy. That's nefarious. That's because either the government screwed something up or corporate greed. There's a disconnect. That's not how the Federal Reserve sees it. That's not how economists see it, but it matters how people see it, right? that's also translating into the largest surge in anti-corporate sentiment that we've ever seen in both political parties. Doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. There's a huge anti-corporate backlash going on, and that's going to be important no matter, regardless of who gets in the White House. The housing market. We're starting to take out home equity lines of credit. We've got equity in our homes, a lot of wealth from baby boomers. We have a little bit of a thaw with actually the fall in rates that we've seen already in the 10-year bond and fall in mortgage rates. That's going to create a thaw in what's called the mortgage winter. We saw existing home buyers, homeowners frozen in place, and first-time home buyers frozen out. We have the largest generation of 30-somethings ever. 12,000 millennials a day are turning 35. Every single day. And they all want to buy a home. And many of them have been frozen out. Affordability in the housing market is at its lowest levels since the early 1990s, despite the fact that mortgage rates are not at the double-digit rate, early 1980s, despite that they're not at the double-digit rates, hit almost 20% in 1982. They're not at those levels, but home values have got picked up because we have acute shortages of housing. This is decades in the making. The limiting of density, the underbuilding following the subprime crisis. Home ownership costs also have gone up because homeowners insurance has gone up. The second largest reason that housing deals fell through in the month of July was homeowners insurance was too expensive or unavailable. And then you overlay home maintenance costs. Those have also gone up as well. The cost of building a home is up 40% still on materials alone, even though we've seen some fall in some of those materials costs since the height of the pandemic. That makes it harder for builders to continue building. And we've seen a lot of this. The good news is there's a lot of pent-up demand, and the lowering of mortgage rates will unleash some of that pent-up demand, but it will get worse before it gets better because it takes time to ramp up again. And also, affordability is still low. And as long as we don't hit a recession, we have 87% of renters want to buy. Almost 50% think they'll never be able to own a home. If mortgage rates come down and we get a little more supply out there and start to unlock the fact that baby boomers are aging in place instead of moving out of the homes that they're in, we'll see a little more housing activity as well. Business investment. We've got cross currents going on. We've got lower interest rates all of a sudden. There's hesitation for fear of recession. And 62% of CEOs, when we survey them, say they'll wait out the election as we get closer to election to make big investment decisions because they don't know the course of policy going forward. Those things, uncertainty is a tax on the economy. But that anti-corporate sentiment I mentioned is important as well because it makes it much harder to extend all of the corporate tax cuts that are lapsing in 2025. And that's something already, no matter who gets elected, many people are struggling with in Congress. So in our own forecast, we don't have corporate tax cuts being extended. We have many of the personal tax cuts being extended because they hit almost 53% of US households. Also, in the polling, it shows absolutely no willingness to lower taxes and keep them low for the highest income households, regardless of party affiliation. Major shift from what we've seen in the past. There is actually odd bedfellows forming in Congress, people who are the extremes of both political parties getting together in terms of some of these policies, reflecting their constituents, which just makes it difficult for all those lapsing tax cuts, 25 of them in 2025, to all of them be extended. So that's a headwind for business investment. The good news is we'll have the tailwind of lower interest rates. Inventories, we were stocking up in part in the second quarter because people were front-running tariffs. Tariffs are important. They're a tax that we pay, not that the other country pays. It's important because we saw retailers stock up ahead of new tariffs. Halloween, stuff was being sold in June. In fact, the Costco by me sold out of all their Halloween stuff already. That's stunning. I've never seen Halloween in July, and it's August already. It's the second largest holiday of the year, next to Christmas, by the way, for retailers. But that's important to understand, because what we're seeing is there is a real hedging activity. Also, there's a threat of port strikes still this August on the East Coast. We've gotten much more nimble in responding to disruptions when they occur in supply chains, but it means we stocked up and now we've got to drain those inventories. That's exacerbating the weakness in manufacturing, but as interest rates come down and we drain those inventories, we'll be in good shape in 2025 and at the end of the year to start rebuilding again. And that will be a tailwind going into 2025. Government spending, well, we've got 6 months of spending, or a whole year of spending in 6 months, the second and third quarter, because we didn't pass a budget until the end of March, and it's all got to be spent by October 1st. And of course, we're not going to do a new budget for fiscal year 2025 because we've got an election and nobody wants to commit to anything until they see whose party wins and what the priorities are going to be. That means that government spending at the federal level will actually be a drag on the overall economy as we go into the fourth quarter after being a bump in the second and third quarter, and into early 2025. We've also got that nasty thing called a debt ceiling. It expires January 1st, 2025. Now, it can be extended, but nonetheless, all of our downgrades as a country have not come from the fact that we've got an enormous amount of debt. They've come from the fact of our political shenanigans, that we've not been able to come together and do something as simple as not use an antiquated law to actually threaten to default on our debt to all of our borrowers, including ourselves. At the state and local level, we had revenues exceed anything that states had seen. The state of Illinois went from a rainy day fund of $60,000 in 2020. I'm from Chicago. $60,000, that's not even like a minute's worth of spending for the state of Illinois. What do we have today? $2 billion. Stunning. That sort of whiplash we saw is part of the reason we saw state and local governments fill some of the gap left by the slowdown in private sector spending. Revenues are slowing, though, at the state and local level, which now they're not going to have as much money going into fiscal 2025 to finally replace the jobs. Wages are finally picking up, and they're finally able to hire people they couldn't compete for during the hiring frenzy. That is going to dissipate as we go into next year. That's all the more reason why we need more strength in the private sector and more stimulus for the private sector as inflation cools to be able to keep the economy going. You add it up and what do you get? The economy from a fourth quarter to fourth quarter basis, which is the best measure of momentum, was 3.1% in 2023, and we expect 2% in 2024, and about the same in 26, all the way through 26. Unless we have a major change in policies. One of the biggest shifts that economists have looked at has been shifts in tariffs and immigration policy. And these are thorny issues. If you get people from the political extremes, University of Maryland has done this, the Bipartisan Policy Center has done this, and you get them together in a room to talk about in a reasonable way with each other and relate about immigration, the deficit, Social Security. They agree on 80 to 90% of the solutions. It's when we get in our echo chambers, we can't bridge those differences. But it's important to remember, because if we see a major uptick in tariffs and the slowdown in immigration like we saw previously, from 2016 to 2019, it fell 40% from trend on legal immigration. That is a problem because we're getting older. We're aging, and we don't have those workers to pay into the system to pay for those who are pulling out. That is a problem. And even undocumented workers pay into Social Security. Lots of issues, thorny issues for state and local governments. But if you go on to a protectionist, and we're already a lot of protectionism, regardless of which administration you talk about, but if you have a major increase in tariffs, the USMCA is up for renegotiation in 2026. It could be ended if we don't reaffirm it in 2026 by 2036. if you have a major increase in tariffs and you curb immigration and increase deportations dramatically, you get a much worse economic situation. You get inflation, the Fed having to reverse course and recession by 2026. Our scenarios are more benign than the consensus, but I'm just putting that out there. Those are things we have to work for. We think they're more benign because the business community would really be hit hard, and so would jobs, if all of the policies that are being proposed were to be enacted. And we have to think about that when we think about going forward. So when you think about inflation, what does all this mean for inflation? Well, the good news is inflation has slowed. Chair Powell was careful to say in his press conference that we don't need much of an improvement from here, because last year we had such an improvement in inflation, all the low-hanging fruit of oil prices falling and a lot of goods prices coming down as supply chains healed. That was not really sustainable, but it meant for a much lower base, so the year-on-year comparisons get harder in the second half of this year. So year over year, we actually could see inflation sort of move sideways, but as long as month to month we stay near where we've been, that will roll over as we get into 2025. The quality of the improvement in inflation in recent months has been much better than what we saw in the back half of 2023, across more items and more goods, with some goods prices actually falling in price, but more items and more services cooling rather than accelerating. It's not just as in one sector. We're still not to where we were pre-pandemic, and obviously you do need some price declines in some things, and you're seeing discounting pick up. It has to, because you need to offset the increase that we're seeing in things like healthcare costs, which are demographic driven, and a legacy of COVID. Long COVID is here, and people are more sick than they once were. I personally think I have cost my insurance company a lot of money, because I've had 27 doctors in 4 years and 13 surgeries and surgical procedures. And I stand here in front of you today after being in the World Trade Center on 9/11 and finding out I had cancer in the middle of a pandemic, that I have 3 lesions on my lungs. So if I cough, it's not because I've got a communicable disease and I have COVID. It's because I have an infection in my lungs that's chronic. But I defy the odds, so I believe in defying odds. I shouldn't be able to walk. I shouldn't be able to talk. I shouldn't be able to get out of bed without a fever. And I run 5 miles a day. I've defied the odds, and to my doctors, they can't explain it. But that's why I'm hopeful, because I look at the inflation data and I see much more improvement that's much more broad-based. And that's what the Fed wants. There's also something else that's hopeful, and it's part of this room, and it's part of our future, but it's also a challenge, and that's that productivity growth has picked up and rebounded above the 2010 trends, which was subdued. Part of that was the pandemic acted as an accelerant, much like Y2K and making leapfrog investments. We finally invested and learned to use the technologies that were already in existence. The movement online. My mother, who's 84 years old, can use a QR code with her phone. Now her husband, he's 10 years younger than her. She was a cougar before anyone else. It was hard as a teenager, believe me. When she was dating people 3 years older than me, it was really tough. I digress. That was worth 5 years of therapy right there. He still has a flip phone. We also saw a matching that went on when unemployment rate gets low. People that were underemployed, most notably millennials, could hop to more productive firms where they could get paid more. In tight labor markets, productivity is one of the dividends we got from the 1990s. The tight labor markets even paid dividends into the early 2000s on productivity growth, because people got better matched with the firms that they were with. And those matching of skills increased productivity growth. Also, firms searched harder and searched for skills instead of just pedigree, and cast a broader net and got a better match for jobs by spending more time searching. Those two things together, we know in labor economics, helps to boost productivity growth. And then, of course, there is the promise of generative AI, which is already moving the needle for individual firms. But the gap between innovation and commercialization is still there, even if it's compressed. And it faces one major hurdle that I'm sure you know more than anyone in this room, and that is the stress on our already antiquated energy grids, not just grid, that is suffering under the stress of climate change. 15% of counties in the United States have banned renewables, any investment in their county in renewables. It's the same time that next-gen nuclear plants, nobody wants a nuclear plant in their backyard, regardless of what it might be. All of the regulations make it hard to upgrade our system. All of our coal plants in this country, 15% of our energy, 50% of our CO2 emissions, will be 60 years old by 2030. They're too expensive to renovate. We're pumping a record amount of oil and a record amount of natural gas. But it's not enough to deal with the stress of data centers, which are expected to double in their energy demand between now and 2026. These are important issues that we need to solve for. Gen AI is the first time we've had an innovation where when you scale it, it costs more the more you use it. We have to get over that to be able to tap its potential and its promise while mitigating the risk due to cyber attacks. And that's where you're seeing firms caught between spending defensively instead of offensively. So it's out there, and that, I think, will be yet another move up in productivity growth, but it's yet to be harvested. The biggest effects will probably be felt closer to 2030 than in 2026 or 2025. When you add it all up, you get back to the Federal Reserve. Yeah, they're feeling a little remorse right now. They shoulda, woulda, coulda. They will. Will they move intermeeting? It would take a seizure in credit markets where people can't get lending for them to do that, or a very rapid increase in unemployment claims from where they are today. Barring that, they'll wait to September, but when they move, I think they're going to move 0.5% in September. We have 1% by the end of the year. And by September of 2025, we have their terminal rate at 2.75% to 3%, which is higher than it was pre-pandemic, but that's because we have more productivity growth and the economy is more resilient than it once was pre-pandemic. So we've got also on top of that, the Fed has cheap imports, the dollar's strength. It's making imports cheaper, and that helps as a tailwind. But I'm going to end where I started, and we've talked about the Olympics. This is an Olympic moment for the Fed. A soft landing is what's considered a very rare gold medal in central banking. But they're not easy. The Fed needs to step up to the challenge. And it needs to face its critics and not come to the criticism. We still have more to heal from the pandemic. If this Olympics taught us anything, what we've already seen is the amazing human spirit, the ability to overcome failure and setbacks and succeed to become the best in the world. That is what is the challenge the Fed faces. The good news is they finally have a lot of room to cut rates to get there. They will, they can, the whole world is watching. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Diane. That was wonderful. Dare I say, inspirational for an economist. So I don't say that very often. Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and you're talking about the soft landing. Can you kind of define what that soft landing would look like, right? And then what would be the points deductions, like the step back?
Yeah.
And how are you thinking that's going to happen over the next several months or year?
Yeah, I became a gymnastics expert overnight. I actually remember watching, I'm old enough, I was younger than her by only a little bit, but watched Nadia Comaneci hit the first 10. I think, what's important is a soft landing, they're messy. They have a lot of turbulence. And what I tried to lay out in 1994-95, that was when the Fed was only preempting, not actually combating inflation. It's really never been done while you're actually dealing with a bout of searing inflation. And so the idea that we had overshot so much in terms of demand for workers. At one point in time, we were running, almost double the pace of demand for workers that we had in February 2020 in March of 2022. That's cool, but it's still above the pace of 2020. That's good. But I think that's where the Fed has a little room, but they need to be able to not let unemployment go much higher than it is. Now, their own definition of a soft landing, it changes. And right now, it's not what it was in 94, 95, 96. It is that we get an economy where we don't go into a full-blown recession. But as we've seen in the last few days, that's a rocky road. And you've also seen the Fed react. Major people within the Fed have said, we can fix this. The labor market's we're not in recession yet. And even though we triggered the Somme rule, which is this rule, rules are meant to be broken, we're not in a recession yet, but we can fix it. That's remorse when they say that. Austin Goolsbee at the Chicago Fed said that. I know him well. Larry Daly has talked about it. But soft landings are rocky, so it won't be smooth. But the good news is, if we can settle in at an unemployment rate for 1, for 2, once we get into 2025, that would be a soft landing for the Fed, and that's historically low.
I thought was really important, and I want to get you to unpack a little bit more. Going into an election year, obviously there's a lot of policy uncertainty. As corporate leaders, board members, executives in this room, our roles are to help guide our companies, these very large organizations, through these changes, including policy. How should the leaders in this room be thinking about, especially uncertainty in that policy, more importantly, the, partisan, concept of, I think you said, anti-corporate backlash, right?
Yeah.
So are there things, and it sounds like either way the world goes, right? There's going to be some anti-corporate backlash. How should we be planning around that?
Well, it's interesting because I rely on our own tax people who are, they're ear to the floor in Washington, and they're sitting there telling us, hey, we don't know if we're even going to get the corporate tax cuts because of this anti-corporate sentiment that's out there. And it's fallen more for Republicans in terms of their favorability. I mean, I have corporations basically at the level of politicians and their favorability, which is low. But I think that's important because it means that you've made really odd bedfellows in Washington. You've seen people like Vice President nominee J.D. Vance and Elizabeth Warren team up on going after large banks. You've seen on the antitrust legislation from extremes on the left and extremes on the right, Ted Cruz and people on the left teaming up on antitrust stuff. That's a problem, especially for this room. And I think those are the things we need to be thinking about, because that doesn't matter who is in the White House, even if there's a full sweep, because the underlying sentiment out there is so they've got to deliver to the people who elected them. And most Americans and most people in democracies today don't feel like they're represented by their actual, the people that represent them, that are elected. That's a problem too. And that means, you need to actually acquiesce to some of those pressures.
So one of the points you brought up earlier, maybe changing gears to AI, given a lot of the topical conversation in this room, the energy side of it, right? That was a perfect segue. We do have a panel on that yesterday, so I won't ask you to go too deep into what that means. But maybe let's go to the productivity conversation. It's a conversation you and I have had several times over the last two plus years, right? It's really starting maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago when we started talking about advancements in technology. There was a lot of buzz. Every journalist would call and say, tell us how many jobs are going to go away. And you and I had the conversation about that. This wave of AI, especially in the last, I would say, 18 months of kind of the generative AI buzz, we haven't seen as much of that productivity, but it's still coming. You referenced 2030. Like, how are you thinking about that? Are economists more broadly starting to do more research? How are they starting to think? Is it gradual then sudden? Like, how is kind of the field of economics thinking about that productivity gain?
Well, it's kind of, sadly, or the good news or bad news is it's nonlinear. And in this room, I can say that word. Sometimes I say that word and people look at me like, what does that mean? And, unemployment goes up slowly, then rapidly. That's what the Fed's worried about, by the way. But also productivity growth, it was everywhere that we could see it, but in the numbers in much of the 90s. And in fact, in the 1980s, Bob Solow, who was a famous economist, said the computers are everywhere, but where's the productivity growth? And it's not in the data. And we know that it's there and it's going to be there. Economists are looking at all kinds of things, but this sort of hybrid analysis that's coming out is that every time we've had one of these kinds of waves, it's also generated a whole new spectrum of jobs. And even on computer programming, they actually think the demand for computer programmers is going to increase, but it's going to be a different kind of computer programmer. Sure. And they're going to be able to do more sophisticated programs. So, it changes the nature of jobs that are demanded, and that's what we're starting to see already, is that the nature of jobs. And even I've been in our Ignition lab working on some of the stuff we work on, and all of a sudden, some of the stuff we're realizing, wait a minute, that means a different job here that we need. That's a whole new job. Yeah. So it's not just that it replaces all workers. Now, what it could do is it does, the early studies of it, and these are just the early studies, is, with call centers and things like that, it increases the productivity the most of the least productive workers, which could mean a leveling of income inequalities by raising the skills. And one of the legacies of COVID was we lost a lot of education. Mm-hmm. And we're going to need to make up for a lot. And I think that's important too. And so we're going to need these productivity gains, and let's face it, we're an aging population, and without immigration, we don't have enough workers. We need productivity growth. And even with immigration, we need productivity growth to be able to continue growing, otherwise we'll contract. And that's really important. So I see it as economists are looking at it now much more holistically. They're looking at what's theoretically possible versus what's economically feasible. And what's theoretically possible, you don't need something that can, to 99.9%, produce the best baked goods out there in a small bakery. It's cheaper to hire bakers than run the program to do that and put all the data into it. But boy, the fact that my breast cancer could have been detected years in advance, and I wouldn't have had to go through what I had to go through, that would have been amazing. And that's what generative AI can do.
Absolutely.
And increasing, the skill and the precision of medical procedures. Just the potential there is just enormous. And that's exciting.
Yeah, I love the point on productivity. I think specifically for technologists, when you start thinking about what some of the tooling is coming out for developers and how much more code, every conversation I've had on this topic, no one is saying we're going to create less code. You're actually going to take the same workforce, if not more.
Right.
But the throughput of the amount of code is what's going to change, right? So it's not
exactly.
We're going to increase the capacity of coders. We're not going to reduce that. But we're actually going to, which is I think a fascinating conversation when you start thinking about unlocking new business models, right? If you can create that much more code, what does that mean for businesses? How can they think about their customer strategy?
And opening them. Laura was asking me about that, but even with how much can be done with Gen AI, you still need a pipeline of accountants.
Absolutely.
And so, thinking in these ways, I think, is more productive, and that's the way economists are starting to model this.
Diane, I want to thank you. As always, this was wonderful, and appreciate it.
Awesome. It's good seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So, Diane, thank you.